My name is Doug Hicks. I'm a professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies here at the University of Richmond. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the university. This is a great event. This is Jepson at work. This is the best that Jepson can do, bringing students and the community and the university together, bringing a professor with his area of research and his studies, his insights to bear on a pressing community issue, to create a conversation, and hopefully to bring some insights to bear to help address that issue, to work towards solutions. Dr. Thad Williamson brings a rare combination of talents to bear on one of the most pressing social challenges of our day, sprawl. He's undertaking cutting-edge empirical analysis of data on residential patterns and individual demographics. How do I know he has these empirical talents? My office is across the hall from him, and I see him going into black screen mode, crunching numbers, and that's when I know not to bother him. But he's also asking big normative questions of political theory. He's asking, what kind of society should we be? What is the purpose of the city? The polis. It's the great question that Aristotle asked, and so many political theorists since then. What is the purpose of the metropolis? What kind of community should we be? He's asked that question about our own metropolis, the city of Richmond, the region of Richmond. He's become one of Richmond's leading public thinkers and commentators. He's taken the best intellectual insights that he has. He's become not only one of the city's leading thinkers, but with this book, one of the nation's leading thinkers on this issue of land use, of space, of sprawl. He will become a national voice on the moral significance and the policy choices that we have on sprawl and urban and suburban development. Thad shows that sprawl is a matter of individual preferences and residential choices multiplied hundreds of times over, but is also the result of local, state, and national public policies favoring certain groups and forms of transportation and industry and growth. Thad shows, in short, that sprawl is a matter of individual agency and collective leadership. Thad Williamson is Assistant Professor of Leadership Studies in the Jepson School. He received a bachelor's degree magna cum laude and is a graduate of Brown University, a master's from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and a PhD in government from Harvard University, where he had on his dissertation committee the luminaries Michael Sandel and Robert Putnam. He won major national awards for his dissertation, from which arose his award-winning book, Sprawl, Justice, and Citizenship, which is already a monthly selection at the Harvard Coop in Cambridge, and will be a selection, it's already a monthly selection in my courses at the University of Richmond, and will be on the selection list of many professors across the country. We'll create a lot of conversations in the city and across the country as well. After Thad's talk, there will be a book signing in the back. I see there are books available. And he will also be having a lunch with anyone who would like to join him in the dining hall, Dutch treat, with the kind of conversation we hope to have after this talk. We'll have question and answers here, and then he'll go over to the dining hall with all comers to continue that conversation. Please join me in welcoming Thad Williamson.
Thanks for being here, especially those of you who are here by choice. I want to thank our friend Doug for the generous introduction. I also want to thank two other people. One helped me with the policy, my wife Adria. Doug talked about the black space, black screen time, is also black whole time. Since I'm at home, I'm trying to forget about the PowerPoint. We're actually not going to show, because the purpose of the talk is to talk about the ideas in the book. But I do have numbers there. Here's the numbers. That's sort of my security blanket. So we have those in the PowerPoint. I'll just put those together. So thanks for that. So as Doug mentioned, the subject of my talk today is suburban sprawl in the United States. And I want to talk about it's really not just one, but two themes, both of which are in my mind linked together. The first is the question that's the subject of the book. Is the sprawling pattern of metropolitan development characteristic of the United States in the second half of the 20th century healthy or unhealthy for our democracy and for our society, and in what respects? And most of the talk will be devoted to that question. But after exploring that question, I do want to spend a few minutes on a second topic, one that's more forward-looking and backward-looking, namely, how can we achieve a more ecologically sustainable and socially just pattern of metropolitan development going forward over the next 20 or 40 years, especially given the dual challenges of continued rapid population growth and the urgent need to reduce our nation's carbon footprint. And finally, in our discussion period, I would be happy to address some implications of this analysis of the sprawl's consequences for how we live and how we grow here in the city of Richmond and in the Richmond metropolitan area. So Richmond is a particularly striking example of some of the negative social and ecological consequences associated with sprawl, yet it's exactly the kind of place that, in my view, will most need to change in order to cope with ecological challenges facing this generation. So I've already tipped my hand a little bit. Insofar as you may have already guessed, my message today is not that the continual, indefinite expansion of automobile-oriented, low-density communities on the perimeters of our metropolitan areas is a wholly salutary development or an example of wise policy and action. And in fact, most academics who write about sprawl are critics, and I suspect that, like me, many were drawn to the topic out of some sort of initial feeling of revulsion or intuitive disgust at having spent a little bit too much time in a suburban traffic jam. In my case, it was suburban Northern Virginia in the 1990s. But one major challenge is not to allow our initial intuitions, our initial prejudices, even our initial experiences cloud our judgment. In the case of sprawl, everyone has an anecdote to share and an opinion to express, and that's not a bad thing. Sprawl is a publicly debated topic, and we want citizens to be engaged in sharing their views. But we also want, ideally, citizens to be interested not just in expressing their own opinion or their own experiences, but also searching out relevant information and facts to broaden their knowledge, rather than assuming we already know it all, or that we can fully judge a complex social phenomena through the lens of our personal experiences. So the role of scholarship in this kind of public discussion, I think, is twofold. And I will listen in reverse order of importance. The first task is to try to obtain relevant data and factual information pertaining to the phenomena we're discussing, in this case, sprawl. This task is particularly important in the case of sprawl because there is far from universal consensus, even among scholars, concerning what precisely sprawl is. And while there's quite a bit of agreement about what causes sprawl, there is still much that we do not know about the effects of sprawl and whether they are worth worrying about. So this empirical task alone is formidable, and is a task my book attempts to make a contribution to using the methods of social science research. But the second task is even more important in my view, and that is thinking carefully about what the standards are we should use to evaluate the evidence that we assemble. Facts are just facts, and have no moral or ethical significance unless or until we invoke an ethical framework and begin making claims about what is good and what is bad. But because there is significant disagreement about what should count as good or just in social and political life, it is incumbent upon persons using such terms to specify just what they mean. In short, in investigating sprawl or any other complex issue, we must proceed on two fronts simultaneously: an empirical, data-driven inquiry and a normative, value-based inquiry. Because the amount of data out there is limitless, almost as limitless as the sprawling metropolis, it's best, in my view, to begin first by defining carefully the phenomena we want to look at. Second, we need to specify the value questions that are at stake, or that are relevant to that phenomenon. Third, using those value questions, we draw those questions to guide, and in fact to limit, our search for relevant data and information. And fourth, finally, we evaluate the data that we find in light of those same value questions and begin to form some judgments about both what kind of problem sprawl may be and what, if anything, we might do about it. Now, I've given you a longer methodological wind-up than maybe you're expecting. Not just because it helps explain my own project, but also because I think this process is very much the kind of thing all of us as faculty at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies are engaged in one way or another, whether our primary fields are more on the social science side or on the ethical and philosophical side. Leadership involves attention to both facts and values, and involves attention not just to the diagnosis of problems, but thinking creatively about how those problems might be addressed. And here at the Jepson School, we strive to equip our students to take up all parts of that task. So let me begin again following this sort of framework by defining sprawl. Suburban sprawl refers to a pattern of urban development characterized by low density and high reliance on automobile. Sprawl is typically, but not exclusively, located on the suburban fringes of metropolitan areas. In my usage, when I use the term sprawling neighborhoods or sprawling places, I mean those places in the metropolitan area that are lower density and auto-oriented, in contrast to higher density, less car-oriented neighborhoods typically located in or near the central city. So that's my definition of sprawl. There are many others in the literature, and we can talk about some of those if you like. But it's really a definition of sprawling places, and really thinking about neighborhoods as a level of analysis. Well, here are the 4 value questions I posed in my book about sprawl. First, is it efficient? Second, is it fair? Third, is it healthy for American democracy and gay citizenship? And fourth, is it ecologically sustainable? Now, the first 3 of these questions each map onto distinct traditions in contemporary political thought. Traditionally, it's utilitarians, those who want to create the greatest good for the greatest number, who are thought to be most centrally concerned with efficiency. It's liberal egalitarians who define justice as fairness. They argue that because justice is the prime virtue of any set of social arrangements, obtaining justice normally takes precedence over all other considerations. And the third tradition is that of civic republicanism. And civic republicanism, in effect, argues that any political system or system of social justice can only be as good as the quality of the citizens who compose it. Now, most of us would probably agree that efficiency, justice, and healthy civic life all are good things. And we should try to get all of them, or as much of them as we can, to the degree that we can. In some cases, however, these goods may come to tension with one another, at which point we have to ask hard questions about where our priorities really should be. But let's take a look at the evidence first. Because of our time considerations, what I'm giving you is very much a thumbnail sketch of the analysis you can find in the book. So I just want to convey the big picture. So first question, is sprawl efficient? Answering that question definitively, it turns out, is incredibly difficult. So let me introduce 3 different ways of answering the question, or approaching the question. The first angle, and probably the most common approach in the literature, is to simply compare the cost of building low-density communities on the fringes of metropolitan areas with the cost of building the same sorts of developments closer into the city, in a central city or infill development, that sort of thing. And here are 2 kinds of cases to consider. One is the case in which a thriving or formerly thriving urban neighborhood is abandoned. The factory closes down, people leave town. The highway runs the neighborhood, people leave. Everyone picks up and moves to a brand new neighborhood in suburbia or some new fast-growing city in the Sun Belt, such as Phoenix. Infrastructure, schools, roads, parks, all the things that formerly were fine are now left to rot, and replacements must be built somewhere else in new locations to accommodate the needs of those who are left. Now, I think most people would agree without a whole lot of detailed argumentation, that this kind of example represents a substantial efficiency loss. Although to my knowledge, no one has yet convincingly quantified the aggregate cost involved in the city neighborhood's decline and replacement infrastructure must be built elsewhere. But the second case is probably the more common case. The first case is important, and it's happened a lot in America. But the second case is probably more common and probably a more critical question going forward. And that's the case in which we're comparing building a new development in one place rather than another. Do you put it on the metropolitan fringe in Greenfield, or do you put it closer in? And in this case, it's a much closer call. However, the way that studies we have so far is, if all things considered, more sprawling type development is overall, which means in some cases will be, the number will be, I have to say, will be a lot bigger, in some cases will be smaller. But overall, typically, the more sprawling type development is about 5 to 10% more expensive to build and maintain the central city-oriented development. And that's taking all costs together, the private costs and the public costs. So that's one way to approach the question, just how expensive is this stuff to build and to sustain. But not considered. The second, rather different way of asking the question, and this would be the angle favored by many urban economists. Instead of asking whether sprawl is inherently cheaper to build or more efficient than traditional urbanist development, we simply instead ask whether the policies we have adopted as a society are rational and compel people to take the full social cost of their actions. And if they do, it follows that the choices people make will also be rational, because it will be forced to pay the full price for things. Now, most economists and others who ask that question believe that our policies have, in fact, by and large, been far too tilted in favor of suburban development. For instance, studies consistently show that drivers do not have to pay the full marginal social cost of our driving. That is, every time you step in the car, society as a whole, and not the person behind the wheel, is helping pay some of those costs. Others point to the disproportionate subsidies offered to homeowners in the form of the federal mortgage interest tax reduction, and to the frequent use by urban localities of zoning policies intended to prevent higher density development or renters from coming into their communities. But what if such policies, even though they subsidize one kind of development over another, are popular? For instance, a recent national opinion poll, which perhaps not coincidentally was commissioned by the Home Builders Association, but the poll found that 70% of Americans favor keeping the mortgage interest deduction for homeowners, even after being reversed their arguments against it. And this sort of observation raises the third question, or third way to think about the efficiency problem. And that's simply asking this question: what kinds of communities do people, in fact, prefer to live in? So after all, if people like living in low-density, sprawling neighborhoods, maybe they're worth paying a little bit extra for it. And maybe we should not be so upset or concerned that democratically elected governments enact policies that tend to favor the low-density way of life. And indeed, opinion polls have consistently shown over the years that most Americans do prefer to live in a small town over a big city. Now, this does not mean that Americans necessarily like everything about sprawl, but it does mean that given the choice between low and high density, most have chosen low density places. In my own analysis of survey data on residential preferences and a local social trust of nearly 30,000 Americans carried out in 2000, I found that persons living in lower density, car-oriented suburbs are substantially more likely to say that they like their neighbor, they trust their neighbors a lot, and to say that the quality of life in the local community is excellent compared to persons living in higher density central cities. So local trust and quality of life actually seem to be positively correlated with low density. And moreover, regression analysis, multivariate analysis shows that this relationship holds up even after controlling for many other demographic factors at both individual and community level, such as race, education, income, and region of the country. At first glance, then, it seems pretty clear that if we think giving people what they want is important, that we should be pretty happy that the United States has built so many large density communities. But here's where things get really tricky for the utilitarian who's trying to identify the most efficient course of action. It is obviously true that the choices we make are shaped by what is on the menu. In good economic times, many people probably would get a little annoyed or upset about getting a 1% raise in your annual review, especially when you know that others are getting bigger raises. But I think that these days, most people get a 1% raise would be pretty pleased and would be thinking their stars to sell the job at all. In the case of the choice between city and suburban living, there is good reason to be at least cautious about reading too much significance in people's observed choices, because you've got to consider how the menu is structured. So consider this is a highly stylized analysis. This is, I'm going to say, is a massive generalization, but I think it carries a lot of weight. And it's just simply consider the choice that most American metropolises offer middle-class Americans as people with reasonably adequate incomes and people have the capacity to more or less move where they want. And not everyone has that capacity, which is a key thing to remember. We're talking about people who do have that ability to move. Okay. Here's a choice. You can live in a pleasant, safe neighborhood with good public services, a responsive local government, good to excellent public schools, in proximity to relatively few poor people, get a tax reduction in your house from the government, and also in many cases have a lower local tax bill. Alternatively, you can live in a higher density neighborhood with questionable public services, an overstretched, often inefficient, and sometimes corrupt local government, substantial violent and nonviolent crime, questionable to bad public schools, close to many concentrated social problems, and perhaps also have the privilege of living in such a place, have a higher local property tax bill. Now, given that choice, it really should be no surprise that many millions and millions of people have chosen the suburbs. But it's impossible to know with a whole lot of confidence how much that choice is because of density itself, and how much is because of the way density correlates with social inequality and social problems in the United States. Consider what if central cities were not synonymous in many people's minds and in reality with concentrated social problems? And what if middle-class families or the poor had no rational reason to think their life prospects would be significantly better if they lived in the suburbs? If that were the case, would they still choose low density over high density so consistently? Or would more opt for the vibrancy of city life over the perceived boredom of suburbs? Now, I think it's extremely difficult to answer that question in the absence of a genuine real-life experiment. And I should say that some critics of sprawl are perhaps overconfident that improving city conditions in a very substantial way would necessarily change the choices Americans make on a massive scale. Because the data does suggest that maybe there really is something about low density itself that Americans prefer and might continue to prefer, or at least many Americans, even if high density were not so closely tied to social problems. Still, it's quite hard to believe that at least some people would not make different choices than they do now if the urban alternative would become substantially more attractive on the dimensions I just talked about. So, in my view, any attempt to definitively state that sprawl is or is not more efficient than its alternatives faces intractable difficulties. Even if we conclude sprawl is a bit more expensive, we must consider the fact that so many people seem to prefer low density. But once we consider that question about preferences in the mix, we have to raise the further question I just raised of why people come to all those preferences in the first place, and whether those preferences might change if our cities and suburbs were arranged differently. There will always be people who will insist on living in the suburbs no matter what, and there will be those who will stick in the central city no matter what, no matter how bad things get. But it could well be the case that many people in the middle would make different choices if the menu were substantially altered. So much for efficiency, and the answer there is inconclusive. But let me turn to the second critical question about sprawl, which is related to something I just said. And that's the question of, is it just? Is it socially just? And there are a long line of minute people, I won't list them all to run out of time, Plato all the way to John Rawls, a 20th century American philosopher, have all insisted that is the supreme social virtue and the foundation of a stable society. Okay, but here's again one of these loaded words we have to define if we're going to have any precision or any real meaning of what we're talking about. So what is justice? Well, a generic definition of social justice is a society in which no one group dominates any other, in which all persons have the opportunity to develop their distinct capabilities to the fullest degree possible. A more specific conception of justice has become a starting point for most contemporary academic debates is John Rawls's idea of justice as fairness. John Rawls is a Harvard philosopher who died in 2002, and he wrote this book in 1971, drawing on ideas he's been developing for about 20 years. And the problem for writing a book like that is to spend the rest of your life defending it, which is pretty much what he did. And revise the view in response to criticism. But I can just talk about his basic view. A just society is one that treats each and all fairly. To do this, he posits, society should implement two principles of justice. First, all persons should be guaranteed a set of basic liberties, particularly freedom of thought, freedom to express yourself politically, freedom to choose your career, and other sort of things which relate to the ecology or basic moral powers. Okay. So the first principle is the principle of liberty. Second is the principle of equality, and this has two components. Society should both establish a system of substantive equal opportunity in which all persons have equal capacity to improve themselves and strive for positions of power and prestige. And B, any socioeconomic inequalities which arise in society should be limited to those that benefit the least well off in society. So Rawls' aim is to specify a society in which no matter what particular position you ended up, be it high or low, rich or poor, you would be content that you were living under the most just possible set of arrangements. And you would believe that you yourself had been treated justly, even if you were relatively poor. Put another way, Rawls argues for a society which would all be one to drop into at random, even though we didn't know what range of society we would have. So if we extend this image a little bit further, a just metropolis would be one in which you or I can parachute out of an airplane without exactly knowing where we're going to land. But nonetheless confident that even if I landed, say, in the city of Richmond, and even if I found that I had dark skin, that my parents were not college graduates or otherwise socially prominent, I would nonetheless have a pretty good chance in life. The chance not dramatically different than what I would have if I happened to land in an affluent section of suburban and Rico County and found myself with white skin and parents who are both well-paid professionals. Now, very few people think that a society, I mean any society, could ever be so just that where one lands on the parachute simply would make no difference. And a subtle point of Rawls' theory is that he recognizes the influence of parents on children is so profound and far-reaching that there may be nothing society can do to compensate for the inequalities that arise out of the parent-child relationship and the process of growing up and sorts of kinds of care that you receive. Other than to simply maximize the position of the least well off. Nonetheless, the image of fairness suggested by Rawls' theory offers a critical standpoint for assessing the contemporary metropolis. Now, the clause I mentioned before about literally maximize the position of the least well off, that's extremely controversial, and polls have consistently showed that Americans reject that view, that we should limit equality to that degree. But the other part, the first part about equal opportunity, evidence also shows that people tend to buy that, or they think that idea is important, and it's important across party lines. Republicans and Democrats and independents all think that we should live in a society that provides substantive opportunity to everyone. Now, how equal they're willing to make it, that's the question. But generally speaking, it's not that hard to convince people that there's something wrong about a situation in which the location where you happen to grow up, having a determined impact on how your entire life is going to go. And most of us want to believe that, that should not be the case. But the evidence suggests that it is the case in lots of ways. Sprawl and persistent social inequality are linked in three ways. First is a descriptive matter. In virtually all U.S. metropolitan areas, poverty rates are substantially higher in central cities as compared to surrounding suburbs. Here in Richmond, the poverty rate for the region as a whole is about 10%, but the poverty rate in the city is 25 to 27%, considering, depending on what data source you're using. That's a poverty rate over 4 times higher than what we see in surrounding counties. And the poverty rate of children in Richmond who are in no way responsible for their own economic condition is even higher, in the 30s, about 35%. So that's one way. Just as a descriptive matter, poor people disproportionately live in cities. Second, public policy typically fails to correct these background inequalities. In fact, they often reinforce them. Poor people living in cities don't just have smaller private incomes than affluent people living in suburbs. They also typically have access to an inferior set of public goods, recreation, public safety, and most critically, public education. Because public schools are funded in substantial measure by local property taxes, more affluent districts are generally in better position to have well-funded schools, though state-level spending can help correct such disparities. But even when central city schools are reasonably well-funded compared to suburban schools, students and most of those schools are still handicapped by the stress that high levels of poverty place in the educational process. Poor children typically have a host of problems in their home lives and their residential environment beyond just low income. And those problems spill over into the school day, which makes receiving even an adequate education an uphill challenge, let alone receiving an education of equal worth to what a middle-class student in a solid middle-class suburban school can expect. Related to this, we rarely take seriously the fact that almost all transportation is an important sense of public. Yes, private individuals may own their own cars, but it's the public constructs and pays for roads and their upkeep, highway patrols, and the like. Systems of public transportation predicated on private ownership of automobiles are inherently biased against the poor. If you do not have a car, and you're living in a community with little or no public transit, you're disadvantaged in your search for a good job that pays well and has a reasonable commute. Here in the Richmond area, the city has a fairly decent bus system internal to the city, though I doubt many in this room would be entirely happy if it was their sole way of getting around. But transit connecting urban residents to suburbs where jobs are increasingly located is grossly inadequate, and suburban counties have shown little interest in developing a more extensive bus system that could potentially connect poor city residents with suburban economic opportunities. Okay, so I've talked about the raw differences, and I've talked about how public policy reinforces more than corrects those differences. The third link is really an observation about politics. And that is the inequalities between our more affluent suburban areas and higher poverty urban areas help generate a political culture that is resistant to serious efforts to tackle poverty, narrow inequality, and expand equality of opportunity. In my research, I find that controlling growing demographic factors, the mere fact of residing in a recently built car-dependent neighborhood is a substantial predictor of greater political conservatism. Likewise, announced election results from the last 3 presidential elections showed that residents of fewer, more car-oriented counties in metropolitan areas were substantially more likely to vote Republican than older, less car-oriented counties, denser places, central cities. And that's controlling other demographic factors such as education and race as well as the region of the country. As studied by other scholars using slightly different measures of sprawl or political ideology, it generally generates quite similar conclusions. The most straightforward explanation of these findings is that people tend to construct a political self-interest, that is, their sense of what is important in politics and what they want to base their vote on, differently, in part because of differences in where people live. So if one lives in a community that's doing pretty well, and and where there's not much need for mass transit, and where poverty is relatively low or invisible, it makes sense that one will, all things considered, tendency to be more content with status quo and the current distribution of public and private resources than someone living in a locality with lots of pressing problems. So whereas our question, is sprawl efficient, yielded quite a bigger answer, the question, is sprawl fair, in my view, has a firmer answer. To put it in precise terms, a particular way we have decentralized our metropolitan areas in the United States has both helped constitute and perpetuate large-scale inequalities in the United States, such that we in fact live in a society where, as everyone understands, it very much matters where exactly a child's parachute coming into our metropolitan areas happens to land. So we now consider the third question. Is sprawl conducive to democratic participation and civic engagement? Now, many advocates and even scholars have thrown out claims that sprawl is bad for social capital, bad for social effectiveness, bad for the PTA, bad for bowling leagues. But is that really true? The data I examined in the book suggests the answer depends a great deal on what forms of engagement one looks at. In the Social Capital Community Benchmark Survey, which is a survey I referenced earlier, the primary data source I draw in the book, the evidence here suggests that sprawl generally has a negligible, inconsistent impact on general forms of social engagement, such as membership in organizations or informal hanging out with friends. Long individual commuting times and often long neighborhood commuting times do help depress such engagement pretty consistently, and they also depress social trust, but the impact is generally quite modest. And as I explained further in the book, it's often a mistake to simply assume that the sprawl and longer commuting times are equivalent. Very often they're not. Further, the most basic and fundamental political activity, which is voting, is controlling other factors roughly equal between suburban and central city areas. Living in a sprawling area seems to make one slightly less likely to vote controlling other factors, but the impact is modest, and it's also contingent on what exactly we put in the equation, what we control for. But for more extensive forms of political participation beyond voting, such as attendance at a political rally, membership in a political organization, membership in a group involved in local reform efforts, or attendance at a march or protest, I do find consistent, robust, and substantial differences between sprawling and non-sprawling areas. In ballpark terms, controlling other factors, if you live in a prototypical urban neighborhood, it's not highly car dependent. You're about 20 to 30% more likely to have participated in one of these political activities I just described, compared to the same person living in a sprawling area. Now, there are several possible explanations to that finding. One is that urban residents may have greater motivation to participate in such politics because their communities face tougher problems, more immediate problems. The second is the characteristic layout of urban neighborhoods with walkable streets, face-to-face interactions, and accessible public spaces helps facilitate political congregations. The urban space itself may be viewed as a political resource that draws people in and people fight about it. A third is activist organizations may, for a variety of reasons, systematically gravitate to urban areas. And indeed, analysis of government data on social justice organizations indicates that these are much more prevalent in more dense central city counties. And likewise, formal community organizing efforts backed by national organizations are overwhelmingly located in cities or in inner suburbs. Consequently, residents of urban areas may have greater opportunity to participate in more extensive modes of participation to suburban residents, holding other factors equal. Okay, but does it really matter? Does it really matter that suburban residential environments seem less conducive to extensive political participation, at least for the face-to-face variety in urban environments? The answer to that question depends in large measure on what roles and responsibilities you think citizens should have in a democratic society. A common view is that for most people, what they should really care about is their private life. And politics is essentially a nuisance. Yes, we should vote, but the less time spent on it beyond that, the better. And so from that perspective, lower political activism in the suburbs might actually count as a plus in suburban colony. Now, the alternative view associated with civic republican political theory dating back to Aristotle, holds that extensive political participation on the part of citizens is crucial for two kinds of reasons. First, because it's through engagement with others on disputed issues and taking share of political power that we maintain our own freedom. So, put it in more colloquial terms, living in a democratic society means you're willing to argue with your neighbors. Secondly, because apart from that benefit, such engagement is essential if we're going to hold elites accountable. Otherwise, the people who can control the political system just run away with it and do what they want and nobody stops them. Okay? And if citizens simply don't pay attention to politics or participate only minimally, it's hard to see how they can actually use ruling themselves. And easy to see why political elites might feel relatively unconstrained. Now, raising this set of issues takes us into a debate that transcends the relatively narrow question of sprawl. Of the kinds of activities I just mentioned, only about 8 to 20%, 8 to 20, participate in any single one of them in a given year. And if you think the American political system is doing just fine, then such numbers probably don't worry you a great deal. But if you think that the political system is dysfunctional, and in addition to perpetuating inequalities and social justice, our society is going to face some of its most serious challenges, then you probably would find such low levels of engagement alarming. Okay, this brings us to our last question. Is sprawl ecologically sustainable? Because of time, I'm just going to confine myself to some general observations here. The first is this. In my judgment, of all the reasons for doing something about sprawl nodes so far, that ecological considerations are by far the most urgent. Social inefficiencies have always been with us and always will be with us. Social injustice has been with us for a long time as well. And democracy, most of the time, operates more imperfectly than any democratic theorist can be happy with. But none of those issues, at least at this point, constitutes a fundamental threat to our society's stability. But it's entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that climate change, to which suburban sprawl is a contributing factor, could pose just such a threat to our society and others within lifetimes of many people in this room. So let me just juxtapose three numbers. Okay, the first is that vehicle miles traveled on American roads and highways roughly doubled between 1975 and 2005. The second is the population in the United States is projected to increase from about 310 million now to roughly 370 million in 2030 and 437 million by 2050. And the third is that scientists suggest that advanced industrialized countries like the U.S. need to cut our total, is not per capita, our total carbon footprint, that's the amount of carbon we're creating in the atmosphere, by 1/2 by 2030 and at least 80 to 90% by 2050. And some of you probably know UR set the goal we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And we need to do this. Why? Because we have a reasonable hope of stabilizing long-term warming of the planet to 2 degrees Celsius, thereby limiting the consequences of global warming to what is considered a manageable, at least somewhat predictable level that we can have a reasonable hope of adapting to without causing major economic and political disruption. So in leadership terms, what we face is the challenge of adaptation. Nobody wants the United States to go backwards economically, and that's an important constraint. And indeed, many people in our society are going forward. And neither does anyone else in the rest of the world. Nobody wants to go backwards. So it would be easy to solve the global warming problem and say, okay, let's go back and throw away our TVs and cars and live simplistic, relative lives. And some people will do that, and that's great, but it's just not a realistic hope for democratic societies. People are not going to vote for that. But to maintain our standard of living while transitioning to given that constraint, maintaining our standard of living while transitioning to a lower carbon future will require concerted efforts as a society using all the levers at our disposal. In my view, there will be major changes coming down the pipe. The question is whether we prepare for them by gradually changing direction, or whether they come in the form of a violent thud, like a car hitting a wall. So, in my opinion, dealing with climate change is the most complex and difficult leadership challenge human society has ever faced, for lots of reasons. Not least the fact that whatever we do to reduce our own carbon footprint, it won't be enough. Other countries don't do likewise. But the U.S. is the acknowledged global leader, and it's very doubtful that huge developing countries like China and India could be convinced to pursue a lower carbon model of industrial development if already rich countries like ourselves are not doing our part and then some. Well, we need to use all the levers we can, and the way we organize our land use and our transportation patterns are two levers we can't control through public policy. If we continue to build communities predicated on everyone having individual cars that are used for most trips, we'd have to make implausibly optimistic projections about our capacity to rapidly increase fuel efficiency if we hope to simultaneously make massive cuts in the carbon footprint. We need to begin to shift to more sustainable forms of transportation, which in turn implies that we need to shift away from building new auto-dependent developments, focus on pushing development back to the center of our metropolitan areas. And we need to be sure that central cities and older suburbs capture a large share of future projected growth. Residents of cities, especially those that have transit systems, use on average far less energy than suburban residents because they spend less time driving. We need to steer future development in those kinds of communities. But here's the kicker, though. No matter how strong that development case for living in less carbon-emitting areas, it will not suffice to reverse sprawl unless or until a serious effort is made to improve the social conditions of our cities. So while ecology is the most urgent reason to do something about sprawl, success of such efforts necessarily must be tied to efforts to address the social injustices characteristic of sprawling metropolises, most especially including Richmond. So to put it another way, people may know that it's better for the environment to live in a city, but they're not going to do it. The schools are so considered poor as a standard. People are not going to make that kind of choice where they feel like they're jeopardizing their kids' future for the sake of this far-off climate change. We have to fundamentally change the choice that people make. We want to have having a substantial difference in their behavior going forward. So I'll leave it at that and take any questions. Thanks.
Richard Florida wrote in a book, a recent book, Great Reset, the notion that the new American dream might be something other than owning a home, especially with the younger folks, what they want more is opportunity. What happens if something like climate change, oil prices, and so forth accelerate that? What happens for the suburbs, and what are the biggest threats in your mind for the suburbs if owning a home, of which suburbia is mostly made up of, kind of on the back burner, and what solutions might there be for suburban localities?
Okay, so the question is, might there be changes in preferences going forward among young people, and how might that impact stability of suburban communities? Okay. Well, I think Richard Florida is probably largely correct. We better hope he's correct in the sense that the people think there are preferences may change, and that's one of the things we learned in the so-called gas crisis. Is that, I say so-called because it was gas still underpriced in the U.S. But a couple years ago, especially 2007, when gas spiked up, people's behavior did actually begin to change in some measurable ways. Certain urban transit systems suddenly found themselves full and overloaded. And that's a positive signal because it indicates that if you do change the price, if you change incentives, people's preferences might change. And similarly, yes, there could be a cultural change among young people in favor of urban living. Now, I would caution, I'm skeptical how deep that will go if the school situation does not change. And I think it could be more of there's always been sort of a life cycle pattern where people cycle in the city and go out and maybe come back. So it could just be an acceleration of that. In terms of the consequences for the suburbs, well, I think many existing suburbs need to become less homeowner oriented. Many suburban localities need to be more welcoming of rental housing, and need to do away with those forms of restrictive zoning, which make it difficult or actually illegal to build high density development. So that part doesn't bother me. What's going to happen is the older. There's two issues. One is what's happening to older urban suburbs. Many of which are declining, as you know, probably as fast as central cities, or in some cases, worst case, the central cities all have something going for them. typically hospitals, universities, state capitals. Usually they have some kind of anchor institution. A older suburban community with older housing stock may not have even those advantages, and poverty is creeping out suburbia. So those place a challenge. There's a second challenge, which is what happens to communities that have been overbuilt, where the developers went and put stuff out there that people don't want anymore. And I would refer you to the work of June Williamson, no relation, and Alan Jones, who may be familiar with retrofitting suburbia, which they've done detailed work focusing on land on how do you take an existing sprawling place and convert it gradually over time to a place that's more sustainable in terms of transit and it can accommodate more density. And it's important to show that that's possible. The second thing, and this applies for cities and suburbs, is I think we need a concrete strategy to stabilize employment in all of our places. Right? That's the way to preserve the community, keep it going, keep the jobs in place. We currently have no national strategy for doing that whatsoever. And I think that's one of the things we will have to adopt and create for the sake of preserving cities. We simply can't afford to throw away any of our existing places anymore and build new ones from scratch. They're just too wasteful and too ecologically inefficient. That's a great question. You?
I have two questions that are related. The first is you focused mostly on the American way of life. A lot of the factors that create these problems in America are common to all industrialized countries. So is there some country that's done this ideally that we can learn from? So that's the first question. The second question is the problem with gentrification. If urban areas were to kind of revitalize and rich people to move back into cities, forcing poor people out into the suburbs, it's not obvious that would be any better than the situation we're in now. And you actually do see that in some other industrial countries like France, for instance, the suburbs of Florida. So how do you address that problem?
Yeah, the gentrification, I do take out that topic in the book. I think the way you address that is you challenge the way land markets operate. That is by trying to develop forms of urban housing that are more community land trust, possibly public housing, but things that people will give poor people, essentially take land off the market and give them the choice to stay in the city. Now, in some cases, you might be a relatively poor homeowner and neighborhood gentrifies, they may be happy to leave. This is their get rich ticket. They can sell it for a profit. But the case where somebody is voluntarily forced out, I think you have to do that by through land trust and that sort of thing. But also, I think that effect can be oversold. And empirical studies have now shown huge effects in a place like Portland, where there's actual open growth boundaries. The empirical evidence is pretty weak in terms of the impact. The growth boundary itself does not have housing prices. Housing prices are high, but generally attributable to other reasons, the studies show. And you can have more density, and it doesn't necessarily create gentrification if you're also creating more units. Gentrification, yes, that's something you have to think about. That's not necessarily a reason to continue sprawl. But yeah, it is something to be thoughtful about. The first point about the U.S. versus Europe, I think your question is right in four ways, in two senses. One is that as societies get richer, there's going to be more demand for larger living spaces. That's going to imply new houses will be built. And secondly, practically anybody will tell you that the ideal is not going back to to Manhattan in the 1900s or a situation of extreme overcrowding. Nobody wants that either. So most people would say, let's say that the World War II metropolis in most places, most developed places, some degree of decentralization is probably a good idea. The question is whether you do it in a deliberate way or an uncontrolled way. So I think there are actually important differences between how England handled it and how we can handle it in terms of the new towns that they built, and which had deliberate goal of preserving the countryside and trying to create new suburban communities that would be socially mixed, would be accessible to working class people in the poor. I think that's a positive counterexample. I think there's a professor at UVA writing about ecological cities in Delaware, Dr. Cameron. You remember? Timothy Beatley, right? And he has many examples from Amsterdam and other places in Europe that are cutting edge ecological things. So I think there are parts of things about the U.S. setup that lends itself to sprawl in other countries. A, we have a lot more land, and B, the decentralized nature of our political institutions with their fragmented.
It's not really a question, but I find it interesting. I live in the inner city, and when I go out to the west, I see communities trying to emulate the city with the sidewalks and the stores close by and the neighborhood schools. And how does that fit into everything?
So it's sort of new urbanism and that kind of question. Well, I think that's basically good in the sense of it's creating a community center where there hasn't been one before, and it's trying to draw people out to at least get to know their neighbors. Yeah, I'm all for that. I have a question, and I just don't think we know yet whether doing that kind of thing, building the West Broad Village, for instance, a place that people may have been to by short pump, building a place like that that's intended you can walk around, it's space. But that's actually going to impact the way the suburban residents impact participating in politics. We don't know. I mean, there'd be a reason to be skeptical. There'd be a reason to think that's got much influence on the way they view the relationship between themselves and people in the central city. There's also a reason to be skeptical. It's got much impact on the environment. Insofar as people living in a place like that, they may be walking around more locally, but they're still likely in a car to go to work. So I think I'm all for building the most community-minded new suburban areas we can, and there's no question. I mean, suburbia is not going to stop. That's not my message. Given the population growth, there's going to be new suburban developments. We need to do everything we can to make them as good as we can, make them as ecologically stable as we can. But you can't do that by building in isolation. You have to think in terms of a regional plan that connects them to a transportation network that's oriented around getting people in the car. That doesn't exist anywhere in the country so far as I know.
I'm interested in your look at regions and those that are able to better struggle with bringing the suburban and urban structures back together, local form of government. That's my sort of underlying question is the stronger regions, the stronger central and regional governments, are they in a better position to do these challenges?
In theory, they should be. In practice, I mean, the Portland example I mentioned in terms of land use issues, that's I think, without question, the best thing going in terms of the U.S. Other regions, Minneapolis to some degree, have done forms of revenue sharing. But I really think there's not a really good model that confronts all the issues, like the land use and the social issues. There are models on paper, which I like. The professor at Harvard Law School, Jerome Road, talked about the idea of creating regional legislatures in which every region, every municipality would get a vote, and finding ways. And one of the key things, key insights in his work is not just dividing the labor differently. It's getting suburbs to regard central cities and other suburbs not as adversaries, but as people we're concerned with, as people whose problems are our own. And so I think his insight in that is we can find ways not just to redistribute money from suburbs of central cities, but to have suburban people themselves thinking about and discussing what would be the best way to help, say, the East End of Richmond. And that sometimes you hear that from people who are opposed to regionalism, that they just want to come and take our money. Right, and I think that's critique. Whether it's legitimate or not, the critique is always going to be there unless you can find some way to get beyond it, and not just share resources, but share voices and share dialogue. But I don't think we have the formula for doing that yet. It is a requirement for the future. The Obama administration is trying to encourage regional cooperation at the metropolitan level and incentivizing that to a great degree. Yeah, and as you know, we don't have to tell most of you here that in Virginia we have an extreme example of the opposite with the rigid separation of cities and counties, which you don't find in other states, which creates all kinds of incentives that make it just difficult to do anything serious at the regional level. Fidel? oftentimes the state can make these decisions with just absolutely no forthcoming or local knowledge of what's going on. So I mean, there's a bigger problem for junior college that I need the legislature to do on anything. And I think you're correct to indicate that although people don't want to talk about it now because it seems too hard, at the long term, at some point, in the next 10, 20 years, there's got to be some change at the legislative level in the way our metropolitan areas are organized and in the way some of these specific tasks are organized. But we aren't even close yet to having the political capacity to put that on the table. But it has to come, or else we can't do anything. So, I mean, that's a pessimistic response. I think it's the right response. Well, thanks for listening in, and we wanted to sign, sell books, and go out lunch, and see you later.